In a world where ivory towers can crumble in a single night, Amara Vaughn is about to discover that the people you call family can be more cold-blooded than a winter storm. After her billionaire parents are buried in a suspicious mountain landslide, her world doesn't just stop. It's stolen. Her Aunt Veronica and Uncle Roland use a lethal, legal execution of forged codicils and cold-faced lies to strip her of her birthright and cast her out like trash into a record-breaking blizzard. Reduced from a beloved heiress to a fatting shadow in the snow, Amara's life hangs by a single, frozen thread until she collapses at the private mountain threshold of Kang Jae-chwan. He is a man the world whispers about in fear, a legendary Korean mafia boss with a dragon etched into his neck and ice in his veins. Struck by the silent warrior's soul he sees in her, even as she fades, Jae-chwan breaks every protocol to save her, uncovering a rot within the Vaughn bloodline that only a monster can excise. Hello, family. Nice to have you here. Before we dive into Amara's journey from the abyss to a throne of iron, I'd love to know which city and country you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you are new here so you don't miss a single chapter of this reckoning. Now, let's go back to where the golden era ended. The wrought iron gates of the Vaughn estate were never meant to be a prison. They were the threshold to a sanctuary where the air was scented with expensive lilies and the warmth of a legacy built on grace. For 22-year-old Amara Vaughn, life was a delicate tapestry of silk and light. Every morning began with the soft chime of a grandfather clock echoing through galleries of original art, leading to a breakfast room where floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked hundreds of acres of pristine, rolling hills. To the world, her father was a titan of industry. To her mother, he was a partner in a mission of radical kindness. But to Amara, they were the two people who made her feel like the center of an unshakable universe. She had been raised in the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of elite academies, yet she never wore the arrogance of her peers. She had watched her father spend his weekends in the city's forgotten wards, shaking the hands of men the world had discarded. She had seen her mother organize million-dollar galas, only to stay late, ensuring the staff's families were provided for. "Wealth, Amara," her father would say, his voice deep and resonant like a physical embrace, "is not a throne to sit on. It is a tool to build bridges for those who have to swim against the current." This philosophy of grace extended, most tragically, to their own blood. The sprawling east wing of the mansion was a permanent home for Aunt Veronica and Uncle Roland. Amara vividly remembered the emergency dinners where Roland, his square jaw tight with practiced stress, would explain his latest failed venture. Beside him, Veronica would dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her sharp features expertly softened by a mask of desperation. They were the vultures who feasted at the Vaughn table, waiting for the one storm that would finally turn their gratitude into a blade. The golden era of the Vaughn estate ended not with a whisper, but with the violent, guttural roar of the earth itself. The morning had begun with a deceptive brilliance, the kind of light that made the 300 acres of manicured rolling hills look like a masterpiece painted in gold and emerald. Amara stood on the gravel driveway, the scent of fresh lilies from the foyer still clinging to her crisp school blazer as she waved to the silver limousine. Her father, Ella's, had pulled her into a final hug that smelled of sandalwood and success, promising they would be back before the weekend to celebrate her early graduation. Her mother, Sarah, had pressed a soft kiss to her cheek, her eyes full of the radical kindness that defined their lives. As the car disappeared around the bend, Amara felt like the center of an unshakable universe, never imagining that the mountain they were traveling toward held a centuries-old grudge. By evening, the brilliance had been devoured by a rare, violent tempest that turned the sky into a bruised shade of purple. The air, once humming with a frequency of peace, now vibrated with the low, ominous rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sanctuary. Amara retreated to the kitchen for a late-night snack, the familiar clatter of the chef's pans offering a thin shield against the brewing storm. It was there, amidst the warmth of baking bread and domestic comfort, that the world tilted. A red banner scrolled across the bottom of the television screen with the cold, clinical finality of a death warrant. Breaking, massive landslide buries mountain pass. Private convoy belonging to Vaughn Logistics caught in the path. The tray in the chef's hand hit the floor with a deafening crash, but Amara barely heard it. The warmth of her home, the air she had breathed for 22 years, suddenly turned into thick, unbreathable ice. She stumbled toward the library, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches as she sought the comfort of her relatives. She found Uncle Roland and Aunt Veronica standing in front of the large television, their figures bathed in the flickering blue light of the broadcast. "Uncle Roland," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf caught in the vanguard of the storm. She reached out, waiting for the supportive hold of a man her father had treated like a saint, waiting for the lace handkerchief Veronica used to dab at her eyes during her emergency dinners. But the people standing in the library were not the struggling relatives Amara had grown up with. Roland turned slowly, and the practiced mask of stress was gone, replaced by a cold, hard-set expression that looked like stone. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't offer a hand to steady her as she began to drown in the realization of her loss. Instead, he simply looked at his watch, the Patek Philippe her father had given him for Christmas, and then at Veronica. "The search area is 10,000 square miles," Roland said, his voice devoid of a single drop of the warmth he usually performed for Ella's. "In this weather, no one survives that." Veronica narrowed her eyes, her gaze drifting toward the safe hidden behind the Renaissance painting on the far wall. The mask of the grateful aunt had slipped entirely, revealing a sharp, predatory edge that made Amara's blood run colder than the sleet hitting the windows. The granddaughter clock in the hall ticked like a countdown to a funeral as the golden cage of Amara's life began to dissolve into the shadows of the coming night. The transition from billionaire heiress to invisible ghost happened with a speed that was as violent as the storm still raging outside the Vaughn estate. Within 48 hours of the landslide, the sanctuary Amara had known her entire life was invaded by scavengers who had been rehearsing this theft for years. Aunt Veronica and Uncle Roland didn't wait for a death certificate. They moved with a precision that suggested they had already mapped out the destruction of her parents' legacy. While the rescue crews were still scouring the dark mountain passes for any sign of life, the Vaughn Library, once a place of radical kindness, had been turned into a war room for the legal system's most lethal practitioners. Amara stood in the center of the grand foyer, her eyes red from crying, watching as men in gray uniforms began to crate her mother's favorite sculptures. The air in the house, which had once seemed to hum with a frequency of peace, now felt like thick, unbreathable ice. When she tried to protest, to ask why her mother's things were being packed away while her parents were still missing, Roland caught her by the arm. His grip was no longer the soft, supportive hold of an uncle who begged for emergency loans. It was a vice that bruised her skin. He leaned down, his face a mask of cold indifference, his breath smelling of the expensive bourbon he had stolen from her father's private collection. The smug grin he usually wore during family dinners was replaced by a lethal sharpness. "Listen to me carefully, you little brat," Roland hissed, his voice devoid of the warmth he had performed for her father. "Your parents are dead. This house, the money, the cars, it's all ours now." Amara felt the world tilt as he leaned closer, his eyes shifting calculatingly behind his glasses. "You're a liability we don't need. If you open your mouth to the police, the press, or even a stranger on the street about your inheritance, I will make sure you disappear just like that plane." He paused, letting the silent threat settle into her bones like the winter chill outside. "Do you understand? The world is a dangerous place for a girl who doesn't know when to be quiet." Amara couldn't find her voice. It felt locked away behind a wall of trauma Roland had built in a matter of seconds. She looked at her aunt, searching for a shred of the woman who used to dab her eyes with a lace handkerchief while promising her father they would never forget his generosity. Veronica stood behind Roland, crossing her arms over a designer blouse Amara had seen her own mother buy. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. The mask of the grateful aunt had slipped entirely, revealing a sharp, predatory edge. "Throw her out, Roland," she said, her voice like a thin line of ice. "The cleaners are coming to prep the house for our victory gala. I don't want her dirt on the carpets." With one violent shove, Roland pushed Amara through the massive oak doors into the freezing snow. The heavy thud of the door closing behind her was the last sound she heard of her old life. She stood on the gravel driveway, her school blazer quickly soaking through. Realizing that the golden gates no longer served as a barrier to the world, they were the entrance to a life that had been stolen. The vulture's decree was final. Amara had nothing but the clothes on her back and the small silver locket she had managed to hide under her shirt. She clutched the locket against her chest, whispering a silent apology to the parents who had thought they left her the world, only for it to be stolen by the people they had fed at their own table. As she walked away from the golden light of the mansion and into the bruised shade of the storm, she became a ghost in her own city, a billionaire's daughter who had been erased before the snow could even cover her tracks. Weeks bled into a blur of gray concrete and a gnawing, hollow hunger that felt as though it were eating her from the inside out. The girl who had once been the center of a golden, unshakable universe was gone, replaced by a shadow that haunted the jagged alleyways of the city's industrial district. Amara Vaughn had become a ghost in her own city, an invisible remnant of a billionaire's legacy that had been erased with a single, violent shove into the snow. Her beautiful, thick afro curls, once her pride and the daily joy of her mother's hands, became matted with dirt and the persistent grime of the streets, clumping together into a tangled crown of misery that she no longer had the strength to comb. She had found a discarded, oversized navy jacket in a rusted dumpster behind a textile mill. It was stained with grease and smelled of damp earth, but it was the only shield she had against a world that had suddenly turned its back on her. Beneath the heavy, sodden fabric, her rich, deep brown skin, once glowing with the health of the elite, turned ashy and bruised from the unrelenting cold. Her delicate features, which had once reflected nothing but a bright and certain future, were now sharp with the hollow sadness of a survivor who was slowly losing the will to fight. The almond eyes that had once held the reflection of her father's success now darted with the frantic, predatory fear of a trapped bird. The hunger was a constant, physical ache, a roaring in her stomach that made her lightheaded and weak, turning the simple act of standing into a monumental struggle. She learned the bitter, humiliating art of the silent beggar, standing near the back vents of bakeries and hopping for a discarded crust of stale bread. Her voice, which had once been bright and carefree, was now locked away behind a wall of trauma that Roland and Veronica had built with their threats. Every time she thought about opening her mouth to ask for help, she saw her uncle's face leaning into hers. She heard his promise that if she spoke, she would disappear just like the plane. Fear had become her only constant companion, a cold weight in her chest that rivaled the freezing temperature of the air. But the elements were not her only enemy. Roland was a man of thorough, calculated cruelty. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her monitored, ensuring that the Vaughn problem stayed buried in the trash of the industrial sector where no one would look for a princess. Every few days, the low, rhythmic rumble of a black SUV would echo through the narrow, high-walled streets. Amara would freeze at the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized those vehicles. The Watchers, Roland's hired goons who patrolled the district to ensure she never wandered too close to the light of the high-rise district. One evening, As she was nursing a split lip from a fall on the treacherous, icy pavement, the blinding headlights of a familiar SUV swept across the brick wall of her alleyway. Amara scrambled backward, her raw hands scraping against the rough, frozen pavement as she dove behind a rusted, overflowing dumpster. She pressed her face into the cold, smelling metal, holding her breath until her lungs burned with the effort. Through a jagged crack in the plastic lid, she watched the vehicle crawl past with a predator's patience, its tinted windows reflecting the sickly neon glow of a nearby liquor store. She watched the red tail lights fade into the mist, her body trembling with a mix of bone-deep cold and sheer, paralyzing terror. She was a young woman who had been taught that the world was built on bridges of kindness, now realizing that for those at the bottom, the world was nothing but a series of jagged edges designed to cut. Every night, as she fell asleep on a bed of damp, discarded cardboard that offered no warmth, she clutched the small silver locket to her chest. It was the only hard square of hope she had left, a physical anchor to the two people who had thought they had left her the world, only for it to be stolen by the vultures they had fed at their own mahogany table. She whispered silent apologies into the dark, her breath a faint puff against the cold metal, as the industrial district threatened to swallow what was left of her soul. The storm that had pursued her since the night of the landslide finally seemed ready to finish the job her uncle had started. The snow turned into a freezing sleet that coated the pavement in a treacherous glass, and the wind howled through the canyons of steel like a predator closing in for the kill. Amara stumbled, her legs feeling like lead weights and her breath coming in shallow, wheezing hitches. She had walked for miles, driven by a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, an urge to move away from the dark alleys where the watchers lurked and toward the shimmering, distant lights of the high-rise district. It was the only place that still reminded her of the world she had lost, a final destination for a girl who had no place left to go. Her oversized navy jacket was now a sodden weight, dragging her down as the freezing water soaked through her thin sneakers. Her vision was beginning to blur, the neon signs of the city bleeding into indistinct streaks of gold and crimson as her body temperature plummeted. Ahead, a pair of massive, intricate iron gates loomed out of the mist, guarding the entrance to one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. To anyone else, it was a fortress of untouchable wealth. To Amara, in her shivering delirium, it looked like a final resting place where she could finally stop running. She reached for the cold metal bars, her fingers numb and unfeeling, and as her strength finally buckled, she sank to the frozen ground. The locket was still pressed against her chest, a small, hard reminder of a love that had once been her entire universe, even as the world around her went dark. The transition from the freezing pavement to the sterile warmth of the Kang sanctuary began as a blur of fragmented sensations. The scent of snow-damp wool, the rhythmic hum of a high-speed elevator, and the memory of a pair of dark, piercing eyes that seemed to anchor Amara's soul before she drifted back into the darkness. The storm that had pursued Amara through the jagged streets of the industrial district had finally decided to finish her, turning the snow into a freezing sleet that coated the pavement in treacherous glass. Amara had stumbled for miles, her oversized jacket a sodden weight dragging her down, until her strength finally buckled at the threshold of the massive, intricate iron gates guarding the entrance to the most exclusive address in the city. To anyone else, it was a fortress of wealth. To Amara, in her delirium, it looked like a final resting place. She sank to the ground, the silver locket containing her parents' photos pressed against her chest as the only thing keeping her heart beating. The world had gone dark just as the low, rhythmic hum of a powerful engine vibrated through the concrete beneath her. A motorcade of armored black sedans pulled up to the gate, their headlights cutting through the sleet like twin suns. In the center vehicle, Kang Jaichwan sat in the absolute silence of the rear cabin, his sharp jawline set in a mask of stoic fatigue. He was a man who lived in a world of variables and threats, a man who had built a kingdom on the discipline of never letting his guard down. As the gates began to groan open, the lead car came to an abrupt halt. Through the snow-streaked window, Jae-chwan saw his security detail, men built like granite blocks, exit the front vehicle to investigate the obstruction. One of the guards approached the crumpled heap of rags lying in the slush against the gate. With a look of professional indifference, he reached down to grab Amara by the collar of her oversized jacket, intending to drag the nuisance out of the path of the boss's car. "Wait!" The voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an absolute command. Jae-chwan had opened his door, stepping out into the freezing night without a coat. His navy wool suit was perfectly tailored, his watch glinting under the street lights as he moved toward the gate. The snow began to bead on his slicked-back black hair, but he didn't seem to notice the cold as he approached the girl. "Sir, it's just a vagrant," the guard said, his hand still hovering over Amara's shoulder. "I'll clear the way immediately." Jae-chwan didn't answer. He walked closer, his gaze falling on the girl, and the contrast was jarring. This was a young woman who had been hollowed out by the world, her deep brown skin ashy from the cold and her matted curls clinging to her face like a shroud. But as the guard's rough movement caused her to stir, her eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second. In that heartbeat, Jae-chwan saw something he hadn't expected. He didn't see the vacant stare of the defeated or the dull plea of a victim. Beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, there was a spark of pure, unadulterated defiance. It was the look of a soldier who refused to surrender even as the walls closed in, a warrior's soul trapped in a body that had been failed by everyone. It was a reflection of the same fire that had allowed Jae-chwan to survive his own ascent through the blood-soaked ranks of the underworld. Amara's hand tightened around the locket hidden under her jacket, her knuckles white. She looked at the towering man in the expensive suit not with hope, but with a challenge, as if daring the universe to take one more thing from her. Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp once more. The silence that followed was broken only by the hiss of the snow as the guards stood frozen, waiting for the order to continue. They expected Jae-chwan to turn away, to let them handle the messy business of poverty so he could return to his sanctuary. Instead, the dragon did something that would become a legend among his men. He leaned down, ignoring the slush that ruined the polish of his handmade shoes. He slid one arm beneath Amara's knees and the other behind her back. As he lifted her, he was struck by how little she weighed. She was a ghost, a feather caught in a storm. Her head fell against his shoulder, her cold breath a faint puff against his neck. "Cancel my meetings for tomorrow," Jae-chwan said, his voice dropping into a low, intimidating register that signaled a shift in the atmosphere. "Tell the doctor to meet us in the medical suite now." "Sir, the protocol," the guard started, but Jae-chwan turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the man. The quiet intensity in his eyes was enough to make the larger man take a step back. "Protocol changed the moment she didn't stop fighting," Jae-chwan replied. He carried her into the car, shielding her small frame from the wind with his own body. As the motorcade moved through the gates and up the winding drive toward the penthouse, Jae-chwan looked down at the girl in his arms. Her hand had slipped from her jacket, revealing the corner of the silver locket. He didn't know who she was or what betrayal had put her here, but as the warmth of the car began to melt the ice from her hair, he felt a strange, unfamiliar pull of responsibility. The world had tried to erase Amara Vaughn, but she had collapsed at the one threshold in the city where a warrior was always recognized. When Amara finally opened her eyes again, the world no longer smelled of wet cardboard and exhaust fumes. Instead, the air was crisp and filtered to a perfect, scentless purity. She was lying in a bed so soft it felt as though she were floating on a cloud. For months, her body had been a map of aches, her joints stiff from sleeping on concrete and her skin perpetually chilled to the bone. Now, A weighted silk duvet provided a warmth that seeped deep into her marrow. The room was a masterpiece of minimalist high-tech design, walls of brushed steel and frosted glass, with a bank of silent monitors, glowing with a steady, rhythmic pulse that she realized was her own heartbeat. It was a cold, sleek sanctuary that felt more like a laboratory for a princess than a hospital ward. Amara moved her hand, feeling the smooth texture of the sheets, and a sharp, sudden memory of her parents' home flashed through her mind. This was the luxury she had been born into, but it felt alien now, a ghost of a life that had been violently stolen. As her gaze swept the room, she froze. In the far corner, draped in a shadow that the soft, ambient lighting couldn't quite reach, sat Kang Jae-chwan. He had traded his suit jacket for a black leather piece, though he still looked every bit the commander of an empire. He sat perfectly still, his long legs crossed, a watch catching the dim light as he leaned his sharp jaw against a closed fist. His stoic expression was unreadable, but his dark brown eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He didn't speak, he simply watched, his gaze capable of reading the secrets she had buried in the mud. The silence in the medical suite was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of the industrial district, but a sterile, high-tech pause that seemed to wait for a long-buried truth to surface. Amara sat upright, her small frame swallowed by the expansive silk sheets that felt like a cloud compared to the damp cardboard she had called a bed for weeks. The air was crisp and filtered to a perfect purity, carrying the faint metallic tang of the silent monitors that pulsed with her steady heartbeat, a digital reminder that she had survived the winter intended to finish her. Across the room, Kang Jae-chwan remained an immovable pillar of shadow, his dark eyes locked onto her with an intensity that suggested he could see the secrets she had buried in the mud. A soft chime signaled the door opening, and a man in a white coat entered, placing a tray on a rolling mahogany table before sliding it over the bed with practiced efficiency. The scent hit Amara like a physical blow, rich, savory, and undeniably real. It was a gourmet spread that belonged in the dining room of her lost sanctuary, a delicate bowl of abalone porridge, seared wagyu beef sliced into thin ribbons, and a glass of chilled, fresh-pressed juice. Jae-chwan made a slight, silent gesture with his hand, a command for her to eat that carried the weight of his absolute authority. Amara's first instinct was to tear into the food like the starving animal the streets had made her, her stomach cramped with a desperate, hollow roar that had been her only companion for months. But as her fingers reached for the silver spoon, a silver thread memory of her mother's voice stopped her, echoing through the halls of her mind. Even when the world is chaotic, Amara, your dignity is the one thing no one can take unless you give it away. Under Jae-chwan's silent, watchful gaze, a transformation occurred that defied the rags she had arrived in. Amara's spine straightened with a phantom elegance, her movements becoming deliberate and precise. Though her hands were still pale and trembling from the lingering chill of the mountain pass, she placed the linen napkin across her lap with a grace that belonged in a palace, not a back alley. She lifted the silver spoon with a steady hand, sipping the porridge with a quiet, refined composure that seemed to reclaim the space around her. She ate in total silence, the only sound being the faint clink of silver against porcelain. She did not look at him, but she felt the shift in the room's energy, the way his curiosity was sharpening into something more profound. Jae-chwan had seen thousands of people break. He had seen billionaires beg for their lives and street thugs crumble under a single look. He had expected this girl to eat with the desperation of the dying. Instead, he was witnessing the resurrection of an aristocrat. He watched the way she held her glass, and the way she tilted her head, small, ingrained habits of the elite that no amount of poverty or industrial grime had been able to wash away. His eyebrows twitched almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just a stray he had picked up from the snow. This was a girl who had once stood on a foundation as high as his own, a princess who had been cast into the gutter by those of her own blood. When she finally finished, Amara turned her head, her almond-shaped eyes meeting his. The innocence was still there, shadowed by a haunting sadness, but the defiance he had seen at the gate had solidified into a cold, burning clarity. Jai Chuan stood up slowly, his tall, muscular frame casting a long shadow across the medical suite as the leather of his jacket creaked. He walked to the edge of the bed, his presence commanding and heavy, but he respected the distance she had reclaimed. "You have the manners of a girl who was raised in the light," Jai Chuan said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the room like a promise of impending doom. "But you were found in the dark. The clothes you wore were rags, but the locket you held contained the faces of Ella's and Sarah Vaughn." Amara's breath hitched at the mention of her parents' names. The trauma-induced silence Roland had forced upon her feeling like a jagged stone in her throat. She looked at Jai Chuan, searching for the calculation of a predator, but found only the quiet intensity of a man who dealt in the absolute truth. "I am Kang Jai Chuan," he continued, his stare becoming intimidatingly protective. "In this house, Roland Vaughn has no power. In this house, his watchers do not exist. You are safe, but I do not house ghosts. I want to know how a princess ended up in my gutter." The silence in the medical suite felt different now. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating blanket, but a stage waiting for a long-buried truth to be revealed. Amara sat upright, her small frame swallowed by the expansive silk sheets, while Kang Jai Chuan remained an immovable pillar of shadow in the corner. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic, high-tech pulse of the monitors, a digital reminder that she was still alive despite every effort by her own blood to ensure she wasn't. She looked down at her hands, which were now clean, the grime of the industrial district scrubbed away, though she could still feel the phantom chill of the snow and the rough bite of her uncle's grip. She took a breath, and for the first time in weeks, the air didn't catch in a throat constricted by terror. The walls of this penthouse were thick, guarded by men who moved like ghosts and a man who looked at the world like he owned it. The threat Roland Vaughn had leveled against her life finally felt smaller than the protection offered by the man sitting across from her. "They didn't just take the money," Amara began, her voice cracking initially before settling into a low, haunting melody of grief and steel. "They took the world. They took my parents' voices." She looked at Jai Chuan, her almond-shaped eyes shimmering with unshed tears that refused to fall. She told him about the night the news broke, how the silver lining of her life turned into a leaden shroud. She described the legal gangbang that followed, a term her father's old business rivals had once used for hostile takeovers, but one that now perfectly described the violation of her family's legacy. Veronica and Roland hadn't acted alone. They had moved with the synchronized cruelty of a pack of wolves. Within hours of the landslide, they had summoned her father's own personal attorneys, men who had sat at their dinner table, men who had received generous bonuses and seen their children's tuition paid by Vaughn Logistics. But loyalty, Amara realized, was a currency that devalued the moment the source of the wealth stopped breathing. "They had papers," she whispered, her fingers curling into the duvet. "Papers I know my father never signed. They used the chaos of the search and rescue to forge a new reality. They bribed the firm, bought the senior partners with promises of even larger retainers from the new management. And within 48 hours, they had a court order, a $1 billion inheritance, decades of my father's sweat and my mother's heart, transferred to Roland as the sole executive. They had made her a ward of the state on paper, while in reality, they made her a prisoner in her own home. Jai Chuan didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His dark eyes narrowed, his piercing gaze absorbing every detail of her betrayal. He had seen the underworld's brutality, but there was a specific, polished evil in family members who preyed on their own. Amara described the final confrontation. telling him how Roland had laughed while drinking her father's vintage scotch, boasting about how easy it was to turn radical generosity into a weapon against the very people who practiced it. They had used the lawyers to freeze every account associated with Amara's name, ensuring she didn't have a single cent to fight back. Then came the threats. Roland had leaned into her face, his eyes glassy with greed and whiskey, promising her that if she spoke to a single journalist or a single officer, he would ensure the tragedy of the Vaughn family was completed with her funeral. He told me the world wouldn't care about a spoiled heiress once the narrative was set, Amara said, a spark of defiance lighting up her sad features. They told the press I was distraught and had gone away to a private retreat to mourn. Instead, they had driven her to the abandoned industrial district in the middle of a storm and thrown her out like a bag of trash. They left me to die, Jie-Chuan, she said, her voice trembling. They didn't just want the money, they wanted me erased so they could enjoy the blood money without the guilt of looking at my face. She told him about the Watchers, the hired goons Roland used to patrol the streets, ensuring she never wandered too close to the light or found a hand to pull her up. She described the weeks of silence, the way she had matted her hair and hidden in the shadows, becoming the ghost they wanted her to be just to stay alive. As she finished, the room fell back into a silence that was now electric with Jie-Chuan's simmering fury. He stood up slowly, the leather of his jacket creaking, his tall, muscular frame casting a shadow that seemed to reach every corner of the suite. He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling city where Roland Vaughn was currently celebrating a stolen life. Jie-Chuan didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be okay. Instead, he turned back to her, his expression controlled, but his stare intimidating in its focus. They used the law to steal from you, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble of impending doom. They used your silence to build their throne, but Roland Vaughn made a mistake. He walked back to the bed, his Patek Philippe watch glinting under the sterile lights. He thinks he erased you, Amara. He thinks he turned a billionaire's daughter into a ghost. He leaned over the console, his presence heavy and absolute. But he brought you to my doorstep, and in my world we don't ignore ghosts. Jie-Chuan reached out, his hand hovering near the holographic screens that now bloomed into existence around him, the nerve center of his global intelligence network. We give them the fire they need to burn their enemies down, he promised. For the first time since the landslide, Amara felt a sensation other than fear or hunger. It was a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at the man who had picked her up from the slush, a man who lived in the shadows but understood the light better than her own kin. The breaking of the seal was complete, and the truth was finally out. As Jie-Chuan turned to summon his men, Amara knew that the legal gang-bang of her uncle was about to meet the underworld justice of the dragon. The Vaughn relatives had taken everything, but they had left her with her life. Now, they were about to find out that life was the only thing Jie-Chuan needed to take it all back. He looked at her one last time before leaving, his intense dark brown eyes promising a reckoning that no legal system could offer. They want to live like royalty, he asked, a dark, joyless smile touching his lips. Then we shall give them a coronation the city will never forget. I am going to take the world from them, Amara, and I'm going to make them watch while I give it back to you. The scent of expensive perfume and false grief arrived at the park penthouse long before Roland and Veronica, Vaughn even stepped off the private elevator. News in the upper echelons of the city traveled like a contagion. And word that a mysterious benefactor had rescued a girl, matching the description of the missing Vaughn heiress, had reached the relatives within hours. The vultures had spent weeks picking the bones of Amara's inheritance clean, but the realization that the ghost they had created might still have a voice sent them into a frantic, calculated panic. They knew that to maintain their stolen empire, they had to reclaim the girl before she could dismantle the lies they had so carefully constructed. Kang Jie-Chuan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his living area, his back to the elevator doors as the chimes signaled their arrival. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit, his Patek Philippe watch catching the glint of the city lights below. Amara sat in a high-backed armchair nearby, partially shielded by the architectural shadows of the room. She was wearing a soft, cream-colored silk dress, a gift from Jai Hwan, but as the elevator doors slid open, her fingers dug into the fabric, her almond-shaped eyes widening with a sudden, sharp influx of terror. Roland stepped out first, his stocky frame squeezed into a bespoke tuxedo that looked as though it had been bought with a dead man's credit card. He smoothed his short-cropped hair, his square jaw set in an expression of practiced paternal concern. Beside him, Veronica glided forward, her sharp face carefully painted with the hues of a mourning ant. She wore a black designer dress and carried a lace handkerchief, her high heels clicking against the polished marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to Amara's doom. "Oh, thank heaven," Veronica cried out, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of relief. She didn't wait for a greeting, her eyes scanning the expansive minimalist room until they landed on the girl in the chair. "Amara, my sweet, poor girl, we have been absolutely sick with worry." Roland followed her lead, his smug grin buried under a mask of heavy-hearted responsibility. He approached Jai Hwan with an outstretched hand, though he didn't dare make eye contact for long with the man whose presence made the air in the room feel thin and dangerous. "Mr. Kang, I cannot tell you what this means to us. Our niece. She's been so distraught since the accident. Her mind hasn't been right. She wandered off from the private retreat we arranged for her, and we've had every private investigator in the state looking for her." Amara's breath hitched, a soft, wounded sound that Jai Hwan caught instantly. She looked at her uncle, the man who had bruised her arm and threatened to bury her, and saw him standing there acting as though he hadn't been the one to shove her into the mud. The manipulation was so seamless and polished that for a moment, the old traumatic silence tried to pull her back under the waves. Jai Hwan did not turn around immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, a cold, suffocating vacuum that forced Roland to shift his weight from one foot to the other. When Jai Hwan finally moved, it was with the slow, predatory grace of a man who had already seen the end of the game. He turned, his sharp jawline highlighted by the dim ambient light, and his intense dark brown eyes locked onto Roland Vaughn. "Searching everywhere?" Jai Hwan asked, his voice a low, melodic rumble that made Veronica's hand tremor as she dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. "That is a dedicated effort for a girl you claimed was in Europe." Roland didn't blink, his calculating mind already spinning a new thread of the lie. "It was a misunderstanding with the press, Mr. Kang. We wanted to protect her privacy. You know how the media vultures can be. We just wanted our girl home where she belongs." Veronica rushed toward Amara, her high-pitched heels echoing. "Come, darling, stand up. We have your room ready. The doctors are waiting. You've put us through such a scare, wandering into these dangerous parts of the city." She reached out a hand, her high cheekbones sharp and her gaze cold behind the fake smile. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. Amara shrank back into the chair, the warrior's soul Jai Hwan had recognized flickering, but threatened by the sheer audacity of their lies. She looked at the hand Veronica offered, the same hand that had adjusted a pearl necklace while Amara was kicked into the snow. "She is not going anywhere." The command from Jai Hwan was absolute. He stepped into the light, his tall, muscular frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow both Roland and Veronica. His expression was calm and controlled, but his stare had become so intimidating that the air in the penthouse seemed to vibrate. "Mr. Kang, I think there's been a mistake," Roland said, his voice dropping into a harder register as his smugness began to leak through the mask. "We are her legal guardians. We have the papers. While we appreciate your hospitality toward a confused girl, we'll be taking our niece now." You speak of papers, Jai Chuan said, walking slowly toward them, his presence commanding the room. You speak of guardianship. Yet while you were searching for her, my monitors found you in a boutique downtown, laughing over emeralds and Wagyu beef. I saw the liquidation of the Vaughn charities, Roland. I saw the diverted funds. The color drained from Veronica's face, her maternal aura vanishing to reveal the sharp, manipulative edge beneath. Roland's square jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek flushing an angry red. The vultures had come to reclaim their prey, expecting to find a broken girl and a disinterested billionaire. Instead, they had walked into the den of a man who read souls for sport. We don't know what you're talking about, Veronica hissed, her fake smile finally snapping. This is a family matter. You have no right to keep her here. Jai Chuan stopped inches from Roland, his dark eyes like two pits of frozen fire. In this city, I have the right to whatever I choose to protect. You did not come here for a niece. You came here because you realize that a ghost can still testify. He turned his gaze to Amara, his expression softening just enough for her to see the fire he was offering her. Amara, tell them where they found you. Amara looked up, her rich brown skin illuminated by the penthouse lights. She looked at Roland, who was glaring at her with a silent promise of violence, and at Veronica, whose thin lips were pressed into a line of pure malice. For the first time, she saw them not as the powerful giants who had stolen her life, but as the small, rotting creatures they truly were. You didn't find me, Amara said, her voice small but clear, cutting through the tension. You threw me out. You told me I would be buried if I spoke. Roland took an impulsive step forward, his stocky frame tensing. You little. Before he could finish, two of Jai Chuan's guards appeared from the shadows, their presence a silent, lethal warning. Jai Chuan didn't move a muscle, but the quiet intensity in his gaze made Roland freeze in his tracks. The vultures have circled long enough, Jai Chuan said, his melodic voice now a death knell. You came here with fake tears, looking for a victim. You found the dragon instead. Now I suggest you enjoy the last few minutes of the wealth you stole, because by the time the sun rises, the name Vaughn will mean nothing in this city. He made a sharp gesture, and the guard stepped forward to escort the stunned, trembling couple toward the inner sanctum. Veronica clutched her lace handkerchief, her elegant clothes now looking like a costume on a failing actress. Roland looked back one last time, his smug grin replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. As the heavy steel doors closed on the first stage of their confrontation, the silence returned. But this time, it was the silence of a battlefield after the first decisive blow. The heavy silence that followed the Vaughn's failed attempt to reclaim Amara was merely the calm before a devastating storm. Kang Jai Chuan did not let them leave the building. Instead, his guards intercepted them at the elevator, redirecting them deep into the heart of the penthouse to the inner sanctum, where the real business of his empire was transacted. The room was vast and windowless, dominated by a wall of high-definition monitors that flickered with the cold blue light of global data streams. The air here was thin and chilled, smelling of ozone and expensive cologne, creating a suffocating atmosphere that made Roland pull at his tuxedo collar, and Veronica clutch her pearls until her knuckles turned white. Jai Chuan entered behind them, his presence filling the room like a physical weight. He did not sit. He stood behind a sleek obsidian console, his sharp jawline set in a mask of absolute authority. Amara stood beside him, no longer shrinking into the shadows, her almond eyes fixed on the aunt and uncle who had once seemed like giants, but now looked like small, trapped animals. For weeks, they had used her silence to build their throne, but Jai Chuan was about to show them that the law was only one way to claim a debt. You spoke of legacy, Jai Chuan began, his voice a low, melodic rumble that echoed off the brushed steel walls. You spoke of guardianship, but in my world, legacy is not something you steal. It is something you defend. And you have done nothing but rot the very house that fed you." Roland tried to muster one last shred of his smug defiance, his square jaw tightening as he looked at the screens. "You're overstepping, Jai Hwan. Whatever you think you know, it's all legal. The papers are signed. The firm has verified everything. You can't just hold us here." "Legal," Jai Hwan repeated, the word sounding like a curse on his tongue. He tapped a command onto the glass surface of the console. "Let us see the legality of your greed." The wall of screens exploded into life in what could only be described as a digital execution. The first screen showed a high-speed ticker of the Vaughn Logistics accounts, where a large red number represented the billions of dollars Roland had diverted. With a single decisive keystroke from Jai Hwan, the number began to plummet. He explained that while they were searching for her, his forensic analysts had found the digital breadcrumbs of the forged signatures on the probate documents. He had already sent the original, uncorrupted files to the federal prosecutor, but they would not reach the relatives for another hour. In the meantime, he had decided to handle the civil matters himself. Veronica gasped as a second screen showed a live feed of the Vaughn estate, the sanctuary she had so gleefully redecorated. A fleet of black SUVs was pulling into the gravel driveway, and men in tactical gear were not just removing furniture. They were changing the locks and sealing the doors with tape. "That's our home," Veronica shrieked, her maternal aura completely replaced by a sharp, predatory panic. "It was never yours," Jai Hwan replied coldly. "It belongs to the Vaughn estate, and as of 3 minutes ago, the court-appointed receivership under my direction has reclaimed it. You are officially trespassers in your own lives." The display shifted again, showing Roland's private holding accounts, the offshore safety nets he had built with the blood of Amara's father's charities. Before their eyes, the balances were wiped to zero, as one by one, the assets flickered and died. The custom sports car was repossessed, and the emerald necklace Veronica had recently tried on was flagged. The payment had been identified as fraudulent, and boutique security had been notified to reclaim the jewelry from her hotel room. "You used a legal gangbang to strip a child of her birthright," Jai Hwan said, his stare becoming so intimidating that Roland took a stumbling step back. "So, I used my network to strip you of your oxygen. You have no accounts, no credit, no standing. In the eyes of the world, Roland and Veronica Vaughn no longer exist as anything more than common thieves." The most devastating blow came last. A screen lit up with a video feed from the boardroom of Vaughn Logistics. The senior partners of the law firm, the men who had accepted Roland's bribes, were being escorted out in handcuffs. Jai Hwan revealed that her family's friends had already confessed, trading the relatives' names for lighter sentences. They had described how the aunt and uncle laughed about sending Amara to the streets, and how they had toasted to her unfortunate end. Roland looked at the screen, his stocky frame trembling. The smugness was gone, replaced by the hollow, gray realization that he had played a game against a dragon and lost everything. He looked at Amara, trying to find a spark of the niece he could manipulate, but he found only the cold, hard reflection of Jai Hwan's fire. "Please," Veronica whispered, her sharp face contorted in a mix of rage and terror. "You can't do this. We're family." "Family protects," Jai Hwan said, leaning over the console, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Family sacrifices. You are parasites, and I have just finished the treatment." He made a final gesture to his guards, and the display screens went black, leaving the room in a heavy, oppressive darkness lit only by the glowing medical monitors in the distance. The display of power was absolute. In less than 10 minutes, Jai Hwan had dismantled a billion-dollar heist and reduced the villains to the very thing they had tried to make Amara: nobodies. "Take them to the lobby," Jai Hwan commanded, his voice a melodic rumble of impending doom. "Ensure they have exactly what they gave her, nothing but the clothes on their backs. If they are ever seen near the Vaughn estate or this penthouse again, they won't be dealing with the law. They will be dealing with me." As the guards dragged the sobbing Veronica and the broken, silent Roland toward the exit, Amara stood tall. She watched them go, not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet relief. The rot had been exposed and excised. She looked at Jai Hwan, whose stoic mask was back in place, though his eyes still burned with a protective intensity. The inner sanctum had been the site of her parents' ultimate vindication. And as the heavy steel doors closed on her past, Amara knew that the silence of the streets would never haunt her again. The dragon had spoken, and the world was finally right again. The aftermath of the confrontation in the inner sanctum left the penthouse in a state of solemn, heavy peace. Amara stood by the obsidian console, looking not at the screens that had displayed her victory, but at the man who had made it possible. The terror that had defined her existence for weeks had finally evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Kang Jai-Hwan moved with his characteristic quiet intensity, discarding his leather jacket to reveal the crisp white shirt beneath as he laid a single thick sheet of parchment on the desk. This was not a court order or a bank transfer, but a document that carried the weight of the underworld and the sanctity of a vow. "The money is back in your name, Amara," Jai-Hwan said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to ground her to the floor. He informed her that the Vaughn estate was secure, the lawyers who betrayed her were being processed by the state, and the watchers who had hunted her through the industrial district had been neutralized. But he looked at her with intense dark eyes, softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the dragon's mask, and reminded her that money is only paper that can be stolen, forged, or manipulated again. "I didn't take you off the street just to make you a rich orphan again," he added firmly. Amara walked toward him, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor as she watched him unscrew the cap of a heavy silver fountain pen. When she asked what the paper was, Jai-Hwan explained it was an adoption decree. In the eyes of the law, it made him her guardian, but in the eyes of his world, it made her untouchable. He was not just giving her back her father's wealth, he was giving her the shield of his name. He signed the document with quick, aggressive strokes, a gesture of ultimate commitment for a man of his discipline. "From this moment forward," he continued, his stare becoming intimidatingly protective, "you are Amara Vaughn. He promised her that anyone who looked at her would see the daughter of Ella's Vaughn, but they would feel the shadow of Kang Jai-Hwan. To touch her would be to declare war on the dragon, and to threaten her would be to forfeit their own existence. Amara looked down at the signature, a shield made of ink and iron, and picked up the pen. She thought of her parents' kindness and grace, knowing they would have seen the honor in this man's soul despite the darkness of his profession. She signed her name beside his, feeling a tectonic shift in her identity. She was no longer the girl shivering behind a dumpster or the victim of a legal betrayal by her own kin. She was a bridge between two worlds, one of radical generosity and one of absolute power. Jai-Hwan reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical affection that felt like a solid anchor. He confessed that he had built his empire so he would never have to be afraid again, but had forgotten that power is empty if it doesn't protect the light. "You are that light," he said, his piercing gaze locking onto hers with a promise she felt in her marrow. He vowed that no one, not Roland, not the lawyers, not the shadows, would ever touch her again, for she now held the name of the man who owned the shadows. Amara looked up at him, her almond-shaped eyes reflecting the strength he offered. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, a word that served as a new foundation for a life that had been torn down. The morning sun didn't just rise over the city. It seemed to ignite the glass and steel of the skyline, turning the urban sprawl into a sea of shimmering gold. It was a day of destiny fulfilled, a sharp contrast to the gray, blade-like rain that had once tried to drown her. Amara Vonkang stood at the threshold of the Vaughn Logistics headquarters, the billion-dollar empire her father had built from a single shipping container. The lobby was a cathedral of light and polished marble, humming with the quiet energy of a company restored to its true purpose. As she walked through the entrance, a wave of respectful silence followed her. Her security detail, men who moved with the silent discipline of the Kang lineage, fanned out behind her as a living shield. She was no longer the broken girl in the oversized navy jacket. Today, her deep brown skin glowed with health and a fierce, quiet confidence. Her natural black hair was styled into a crown of perfect bouncy afro curls that framed a face that had traded fear for a terrifyingly beautiful defiance. She wore a tailored white power suit, a symbol of a fresh start, with her mother's diamond brooch pinned over her heart. She stepped into the private elevator, and upon reaching the top floor, found her father's office restored to its former glory. The scent of sandalwood and old books returned, and the tacky gold accents left by Roland and Veronica were gone. Behind the desk, a portrait of her parents hung beside a subtle frame containing her adoption decree, a reminder that the past was reclaimed and the future protected. Amara walked to the desk, running her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling a sense of duty rather than grief. At 18, she was a billionaire's heir and a mafia boss's daughter, and she knew exactly what to do with her empire. "The board is waiting for you," a low, melodic voice rumbled from the doorway. She turned to see Kang Jae-chuan, impeccably dressed in a black suit, his sharp jawline set in a rare expression of pride. He looked like a father watching his legacy take flight. "Let them wait another minute," Amara said, her voice rich and steady. They walked together toward the floor-to-ceiling glass doors leading to the balcony. High above the noise of the streets, the city looked like a masterpiece of potential. Amara looked out toward the industrial district where she had nearly died and informed Jae-chuan that the Vaughn Center for Youth had opened its doors that morning. She had ensured that no child who came through those doors would ever have to be a ghost. They would have her parents' education and his protection. Jae-chuan stood beside her, a solid anchor against the wind. "Justice is a cold foundation, Amara," he said, his piercing gaze softening. "But loyalty is what makes the structure stand. You have both now." He reminded her that she was a Vaughn by blood and a Kang by choice, and no one in the city would ever be able to move her again. Amara realized then that her uncle hadn't just taken everything from her. He had inadvertently put her on the path to the only man who could teach her how to turn kindness into a weapon and grief into a shield. A new family had been built on the ashes of betrayal, defined not by greedy relatives, but by the ironclad justice of the man who lived in the shadows and the girl who had found her way back to the light. "Shall we go?" Jae-chuan asked, gesturing toward the boardroom. Amara took one last look at the horizon, took his arm with a steady hand, and smiled. "Yes," she replied. "We have a lot of bridges to build, Father." The story of the silent beggar officially ended, and the era of Amara Vonkang began. They lived not just happily, but powerfully ever after, a legacy of love defended by a throne of iron.